begin my presentation with my thesis statement. Human suffering becomes meritorious when it is united to Jesus' suffering on the cross, because one experiences firsthand the gift of love embodied in his sacrificial act of taking on our pain and suffering. Since there are time constraints and I lack the energy to read more than 2 pages out loud, I am going to just read the parts that I thought are the most meaningful. These parts consist of my reference to St. Paul's quote in Colossians 1:24 and St. John Paul II's explanation of this quote. Then I will conclude with reading a bit about St. Gemma Galgani's and my physical suffering and St. Mother Teresa's dark night of the soul. St. Paul writes about his participation on the part of God's chosen ones, who have been given the unique gift of walking the road to Calvary intimately with Christ, whether it be through a physical, emotional, psychological, spiritual illness, or a combination of these. St. Paul writes, "Now I rejoice in my sufferings for your sake, and in my flesh I complete what is lacking in Christ's afflictions for the sake of his body, that is the church." RSV Bible, Colossians 1:24. Through his battle with Parkinson's disease and all its many effects, St. John Paul II showed us how suffering can be grace-filled when it is united with Christ's suffering on the cross. For me, St. John Paul II was such a wonderful example of how to surrender oneself to the will of God, because he gave himself like Christ gave himself as a suffering servant to the church. In his life of suffering, he made the message of suffering in his apostolic letter authentic. St. John Paul II gives us a deeper insight into suffering and how suffering is an inherent part of the human condition when he writes, quote, "It is as deep as man himself, precisely because it manifests in its own way that depth which is proper to man, and in its own way surpasses it." Close quote. St. John Paul II explains that offering our suffering to Christ transforms the act of suffering into something spiritually beautiful and grace-filled. The suffering of constant physical pain or the torment of emotional pain can weigh us down. But the Pope tells us that this very act of suffering can help us to transcend beyond ourselves if we accept the call to suffer with Christ and the Church for the salvation of others. In its limiting, confining, and debilitating way, physical suffering is a cross which can be offered to God as a sacrifice of praise. It is a means of salvation when one responds to it with acceptance or resignation to the will of God and offers up the pain for the salvation of another. We see this done in the lives of the saints, such as St. Gemma Galgani, St. Therese, St. Mother Teresa of Calcutta, and St. John Paul II. In reading the life of St. Gemma, we see that she suffered from tumors, breathing difficulties, paralysis, and constant physical pain. I find Gemma to be a special saint because she suffered with spinal meningitis as I have. In her writings, she talks about when the doctors discovered the curvature in her spine. I remember when I was 10 or 11 years old, doctors telling my mom and I that my curvature would become increasingly worse in my teen years. When I hit 13, their predictions did indeed come true, and this was evident in a pulmonary evaluation where the pulmonologist told me I was going to die very soon because my breathing capacity was impaired. As a follower of Christ, I'm asked to follow Christ's example of love in suffering by accepting God's will in my life. I have been given the unique gift of experiencing the passions in my own illness and handicap. At the age of 18 months, God chose me to suffer as He did by allowing me to experience the cross through spinal meningitis and total paralysis. There have been many occasions when I have stopped breathing and experienced death. On these occasions, I have become familiar with the preciousness of life and the importance of relying on Jesus for healing and strength. With the paralysis of my lungs, it is physically laborious to get a deep breath. So oftentimes it feels like I am suffocating, and with that comes extreme exhaustion and fear. When I offer up my sufferings to the Lord and ask Him continuously to be my strength and comfort in times of physical and emotional distress, these are the moments when I am participating in Christ's suffering as a member of His mystical body, the church. In times of spiritual suffering, we tend to think that God has abandoned us. The saints call this abandonment by God the dark night of the soul. It is during these times they feel as though God has left them to figure out a path for their life. This dark night of the soul is a spiritual desolation that a holy soul feels because that soul yearns to be with the Creator for eternity. Saint Therese and Saint Mother Teresa are two saints who have experienced this spiritual desolation in which they struggle along life's journey, feeling as though they are the worst of sinners. During these times, they have shown an extraordinary heroism and exemplary hope in God because they have great faith and love for their spouse, Jesus. Mother Teresa speaks of her dark night of the soul in her autobiography, Come Be My Light, in which she describes the absence of consolations and the burning flame of God's loving presence. The dark night of the soul was a suffering for her because it required her to respond in faith and self-abandonment to the will of God when she could not see His works in her life. In summary, my thesis is about the purpose of suffering and the graces that come from uniting our sufferings to the suffering of Christ on the cross. Suffering in and of itself is useless, but it has great meaning when one offers it to God as a sacrifice for one's salvation and that of others. Through our sufferings, we participate physically and spiritually in Christ's salvific act of redemption. And doing so, we make reparation for the sins man still commits on a daily basis. The lives of the saints like St. John Paul II, St. Gemma, and St. Mother Teresa give us a perfect example of those who accepted suffering as a means of salvation.
So, I'm going to ask you the first question that I have is a question that is a common critique of Christianity.
example of sacrificial love when he chose to be crucified and nailed to the cross and raised. That act in and of itself is an act that only personifies love for his creatures, because he's God and he chose to become man to do this huge act of redemption that he didn't have to do. He could have saved us another way.
Thank you. Another question. Our culture is very sensitive today about the infliction of pain or suffering upon animals, perhaps more so than it is about human suffering. And I'm wondering if you, it's clear that animals can feel pain, because if if you strike an animal or poke an animal, they make a noise or they jump away. But I'm wondering if, from your research and your own personal reflection, you could offer any insight into how there is a difference between pain, that is the recognition by the senses of something uncomfortable, and then what we call in the philosophical and theological tradition suffering.
Pain is a physical experience only. Suffering is physical, emotional, and spiritual. Suffering is a choice that human beings make to accept pain that they feel. They choose to suffer it out of love for neighbor and God. And it's a choice. Suffering is a choice that human beings only have the ability to make. Animals don't suffer because animals don't have the ability to reason. So they can't make a choice to suffer.
Thank you. In your thesis, you have different sections on different types of suffering, physical suffering, spiritual suffering, and so on. And I'm just wondering, since you have integrated your own personal experience into your thesis, if you could say a little bit about which type of suffering is the most, say, intense or difficult to endure, and is the type of suffering that is most difficult to endure also the type of suffering that is most spiritually fruitful, or doesn't difficulty and do difficulty and fruitfulness always go together, or not?
They do. Fruitfulness and difficulty go together depending on the choice I make to offer up the suffering or not. Also, the most difficult suffering is probably emotional and probably a combination of emotional and spiritual suffering. Because those two types of suffering hit at the heart way more than physical suffering does.
Thank you. And then I have one last question. What would you say to someone, or maybe you've had this encounter? Let's say someone has no physical ailment whatsoever, but yet they're constantly anxious about their health and well-being and the longevity
suffering in itself. So God has given those people the particular cross of anxiety to carry, whether they understand that or not. And each of us suffers in different ways because of circumstantial evidence or God's will for each of us. But that, I would say, their cross of anxiety is no less, it's probably greater than somebody who suffers physically all the time. Because it never goes away.
Well, that's the last of my questions. I want to thank you for doing a fine job on your thesis and a fine job on your presentation, and also a fine job with the question and answers. I know this has been a long journey for you, and I don't know if you realize it, but you just completed your last test.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nutt. You've been really kind.
You know, there are a lot of people at the university whom you've touched, especially in our department, Dr. Reardon, and more recently, Dr. David Tomasia. And so on behalf of the whole department, I wanted to wish you congratulations.
Well,
And
thank you.
I can't say enough how much we are all looking forward to your graduation. It's going to be something that we really celebrate.
You guys have been so wonderful to me. I can't tell you how wonderful you've been to me. Just so accommodating in every way you can be.
Don't tell our employers, but it's fun.
Sometimes you get nice students, and sometimes you don't.
So I want to congratulate your family too.
Yes, you congratulate my mother and my father
I will.
for putting up with me.
I remember seeing the three of you at the old campus in the vineyards for Mass every day, and so I've seen you, connected with the university for the 11 years that I've been here, and I think you started a little bit before then.
I started in 2006,
Okay.
the spring of 2006.
Okay, and I started in the fall of 2006. So I'm gonna leave. I'm gonna let you guys go now. But again, congratulations.
Thank you.
I couldn't be more proud of the great work that you've done. God bless.
God bless. Thank you so much.
Well, he seems like a really